Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
I'm Bonnie Bay. Welcome to the Contrary, a weekly discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. This week we have the honor of Joann Lublin as our guest. She was a longtime career advice columnist for the Wall Street Journal, currently a contributing editor, and she has written the book Power Moms: How Executive Mothers Navigate Work and Life. Welcome to the program, Ms. Lublin. How are you?
I'm great, and please call me Joann, Bonnie.
Okay, Joann. So you tell me about the book. You interviewed a whole lot of different women in different positions about how they navigated career and family, the work-life juggle, as it used to be called. Who did you talk to and what did you find?
Altogether, I interviewed 111 women, which is twice as many as I did for my first book. 86 of those women are women who have children and have gotten to be executives at a business. And between that group, the 86 women were split roughly evenly between baby boomers, my generation, and women who are millennials and Gen Xers. So women in their 60s roughly, and women in their 30s and early 40s. In addition, there were 25 adult daughters of the boomers who I interviewed. What was it like growing up having a super mom, a power mom as your mother? And to what extent did they want to follow up in her footsteps? So in a sense, it's a look at like 2.5 generations, because most of those daughters were in their 20s.
I have to ask this question because, of course, we've been going through a pandemic for almost the last year, where the kind of moms you're talking about, not, of course, low-income moms, waitresses, domestic people, etc., have been, they've lost their jobs because of it, they can't do it contact free. But executive moms have had their lives upended and possibly made easier by the pandemic, where companies are starting to find out that working from home is a great thing, not something to prevent or cut back on, and that it saves companies a huge budget item, which is rent.
It certainly does. I unfortunately did the reporting for this book before the pandemic hit, but I did follow up during the editing process to find out how a couple of those women, particularly in the younger generation, were coping, who had already worked remotely to one degree or another before the pandemic. And I think you're absolutely right. We've had this huge national experiment in working from home. And guess what? It works.
Yeah, it works so well that, office space in major downtown cities has gotten a lot cheaper to rent, and people I talk to in the real estate industry are thinking that they're going to have to convert, that apartments downtown are still at a premium and there aren't enough of them, and they're going to have to turn office space into condos and co-ops if they want to keep the value of their properties up. But anyway, let's get back to your findings. Okay, so you talked to these women who were extremely high level people. Including some household names like Marissa Mayer. Tell me what they told you.
I think it's going to vary by generation. And that's what the most striking conclusion is about this book. It has gotten a lot easier. It has gotten a lot better. And guess what? It's because our generation, the baby boom generation, blazed the trail. And so these younger women feel like they've earned a right to have successful careers and have successful marriages and have successful children. And while you can never have it all at any given time, you're certainly getting a lot more acceptance for these dual roles.
I'm interested to know what the millennial children of the boomer women told you about what it was like to be raised by a career mom. And on the one hand, I would think it would be a great example to set for your children, to show them that both parents work outside the home. On the other hand, there, at least before the pandemic and before the time when working from home was allowed by a lot of corporations, many of those kids may have felt like they were neglected by their moms in their childhood.
There definitely were elements of both. And I think just like everything else in life, there's a yin and yang to all of our experiences. Many of these daughters greatly appreciated that role model and that example that their mothers had set, and it inspired them to want to aim high with their own careers. But at the same time, many of them missed their moms because their moms traveled a lot. One of those adult daughters chose to become a stay-at-home mom for just that reason, because she didn't see her mom a lot growing up.
And what other kinds of reactions did you see from that would be an anticipated response, doing 180 degrees different from how you were parented. But what other things did you find from the children of executive moms?
In some cases, the adult daughters chose careers where they could have more flexibility in terms of setting their hours or when they were home. And they did that perhaps by creating their own business, where mom had worked for a big company. Another thing, though, was very striking was how much these adult daughters benefited from having their mom as their sort of secret weapon when they got into the workforce. These were women who benefited greatly from career advice from their successful moms.
Now, what do you find that the younger women found as their obstacles? What problems are they dealing with now that they work for companies, at least some of whom you spoke to since the pandemic, who might be a lot more willing to let people work from home full time, especially people like lawyers who are churning out briefs and that sort of thing, which can be done from anywhere that you have a Wi-Fi connection.
Well, I think the problem persists for the younger generation of executive moms that was writ large for the baby boomers. And that is how much help, how much support, how much co-parenting are you getting from your spouse, whether it's a husband, a wife, or a domestic partner. And in fact, a study just was released today by an outfit called New America that Fortune covered, and it found that overwhelmingly, men think that they are caregiving equally, but it turns out in reality, that's not the case. And study after study shows that men and women view this image as to who's doing what in the home very differently.
And how, I, as a child of the 60s, a boomer, always thought that the answer to women who wanted to work outside the home was not so much to rely on childcare, but to have your partner split the work with you and perhaps work different shifts so somebody could always be home or super close by or something like that. And then, of course, this whole generation came up behind me where everybody's talking about we need paid childcare. What do you, how did that show up in your findings when you talk to people?
Well, again, like you pointed out, we're talking about an elite of the workforce here. So these women are making a decent living and they can afford a paid child caregiver. On the other hand, given that about a fifth of the women that I interviewed are women of color, and a significant proportion of those are Asian American women, they have extended family. And so you have this great example where this IBM executive is relocating for her job moving to an area. Her husband also works for IBM, and they have no, family. They don't know anyone. And she reaches out to her parents, who are both small business owners, and her parents agree to essentially sell their businesses and come live with the high-ranking IBM executive and her high-ranking husband and care for their two grandsons. And so the sacrifices that each generation is willing to make for the next generation, I think, is also a very important factor here.
And why do you think low-income working women don't have those family resources?
Oh, I think a lot of them do. I think it's why, if you look back in history, and I talk about this in one chapter, the proportion of African American women in the labor force in the late 1800s and early 1900s was far higher than white women. And it was because in many cases they could rely on extended family for caregiving.
Well, and it was also because they were much poorer, as women of color continue to be, correct?
Absolutely.
So they have working was not a choice for them. It was an absolute. How do you think women in custodial jobs, in jobs where being away from home and at a workplace are mandatory, are going to benefit, if at all, from the pandemic the way women who work on computers have benefited?
I think you just answered your own question, Bonnie. They're not. They're not going to benefit.
They're not at all. There's no way.
If they have to physically be in a building during a pandemic, that obviously there are greater health risks. But hopefully they're working for an employer that is taking measures to mitigate the chances of them getting sick. But I think that has also resulted in a fair number of women stepping out of the workforce or cutting their hours, either because they're worried about the health risks of COVID or because they are so stretched in terms of having to handle homeschooling that it's really not possible. There's some really startling numbers. Women with children under 12 have lost nearly 2.2 million jobs during COVID-19. And that's 3 times the number of fathers.
Yes, and I remember we did a story not too long ago about the December employment numbers, and African American women in that month alone had lost, I think it was 150 or so thousand jobs, way more than white women or men. So you don't see any benefits from the pandemic, if you will, coming out for teachers, for custodial women, for piecemeal workers, for example, seamstresses who could possibly do some of their work at home?
Oh, absolutely. And to the extent that our whole social moray has changed when it comes to how we view work from home, I think that's going to have a broad impact, irrespective of the types of profession you're in or the types of industries you're in. Because, look at the whole notion of sit-down dining. That has unfortunately been devastated by the pandemic. On the other hand, it's created a huge booming industry in terms of carry-out and home delivery of food.
I want to get back to a point you made earlier about men and women's differing views on how much men are helping with childcare and home care. What do you think it will take to get men to understand how much work women currently do and to participate more fully in not just childcare, which is, of course, really important, but even home care, even cleaning up the home?
I think what it will take is this younger generation, and I already saw that in the women I interviewed, essentially standing up for themselves and picking the right life partner and making sure at the outset of the relationship, at the point when you decide to get married or live together, that you have an understanding of the importance of sharing, that you understand that co-parenting doesn't mean that mom does it all and dad picks up the slack. And in my own experience, this was something my husband and I recognized decades ago when we got engaged. And we did so by drawing up a marriage contract.
And did you stick to the contract after you were married? Did he stick to it?
He sure did. And in fact, there was only one sentence in what we prepared for the lawyer that survived being put into legalese. And it was a sentence that my husband wrote. He was then my fiance. The sentence was, household duties shall be shared equally, but not necessarily cheerfully.
So what, the second clause was taken out of that sentence?
No, that entire sentence remained. All the other stuff that we put in our words, she put in the legal language. That entire sentence is the only sentence of all the sentences we wrote that survived the lawyer putting it in the legal language.
What techniques can you suggest to young women who want to get married, young women, be it to female or male partners, and want to have careers and want the relationship to survive, but want half the work done by the other partner?
Well, I don't think the marriage contract idea works for everyone. It's fairly a formal approach, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be having serious conversations at the point when you're getting serious about each other and find out exactly where everybody's head is at. Do you want to have children? Do you think strongly that one of us should stay home? How do you feel about perhaps us taking turns at being stay-at-home parents? What's your feeling as to whose career ought to have priority in terms of not only where we live, but what kind of hours that we work? And you have to get this all out on the table. But then even more important, you have to be willing to revisit these situations. Because guess what? Life changes.
Exactly. Now tell me, the last time there was a federal law on family and medical leave, for example, not to mention child care, was...
There was legislation passed when COVID erupted.
Okay.
That required employers to provide paid family medical leave for a variety of reasons, including interrupted childcare. The problem with that legislation is it expired at the end of 2020, and Congress passed a new law, that comprehensive package that got enacted right after Christmas, that instead of mandating this protection and this paid leave, instead turned it into employer tax credits. So it's much more voluntary. And that legislation expires at the end of March.
So what do you, again, then reverting to the unpaid, the coverage for that you have a right to your job back after you take family and medical leave unpaid, which was passed under the Clinton administration.
Correct.
Biden, of course, is probably the most progressive, certainly pre-election, the most progressive president in terms of women's issues that we've ever had. He promised in advance to take a VP candidate who was a woman of color, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you expect the Biden administration with a barely Democratic-controlled Congress will be able to push through in terms of paid leave, if anything?
Well, I think you're going to be surprised on that front for a couple of reasons. Number one, there is a very powerful business organization, called the Business Roundtable, which actually supports this type of legislation and did so during the Trump administration. The Trump administration came up with a very watered down, weak version of this. And I would expect them to continue to press for such legislation. At the same time, Biden, as we know, has certainly earned his chops in terms of being able to try and strike deals with people across the aisle. And the third thing is he's already created a special cabinet level council to deal with gender issues, and has appointed not only numerous women to cabinet level positions, but many of them are moms.
Moms of young children too.
Yes.
So tell me what kind of legislation you see being signed into law during the next 4 years to help women.
I'm hoping we'll see two types of legislation. Number one, the one we've just been talking about, which is bringing the United States into the lineup of almost the entire rest of the industrial world in terms of providing paid family and medical leave, and in particular, paid leave for new parents. And secondly, I'm hoping there'll be some kind of legislation that mandates federal support for childcare facilities.
Okay, now you talk about paid family and medical leave. Who should pay? Employers, or should it be a tax on employees, or a combination of the two?
I'm going to leave that up to the lawmakers.
Why don't you want to touch it?
Just because I think, like everything else, it's a matter of negotiation and compromise. And so what I favor, which obviously would be an employer-sponsored form of legislation, and what actually could get through a very divided Senate, are two different things. Ideals and reality.
Did you look at the states? And I think there are something like something under 20 states that have already passed paid family and medical leave.
And there's some cities as well.
Okay, and I remember when California first passed it, it only paid, I believe 55% of the woman's salary. Therefore, very few women were able to afford to take that leave. So how has it progressed since then? That was many years ago.
Well, my book does talk about the fact that there are about 20 plus states that have put this legislation on the book. Not all of them have taken effect yet. They're in many cases being phased in. And by the same token, the amount of pay that the individual taking the FMLA can get, they obviously had to settle and compromise to get the legislation passed. But by the same token, as we saw with the work from home experiment, if that works, then we can hopefully improve the legislation going down the road.
What is the future of for parental sharing of work in America?
What I learned from writing this book is that we've made huge progress between the boomer generation and the Gen X millennial generation of working moms. But there is a lot more that needs to be done. And the burden of that responsibility should not fall on the already weary shoulders of parents. The burden of that responsibility falls on the shoulders of employers and upon our government elected officials.
Don't you think that a lot of the progress that we have made, though, is due almost entirely to technology?
Absolutely. If it weren't for technology, we wouldn't have this successful work from home experiment. You just can't work from home if you don't have a way to communicate with your colleagues.
So I wonder, where is technology going to take us in the future? For example, there's already 3D video. Is there some way that technology will allow women who have jobs, low-paying jobs where they must be present to perform them, such as waitresses, such as God knows what, to remotely perform those duties? I can imagine, for example, train sets in restaurants delivering meals to tables, as opposed to waitresses that they sit at home, they take in the order, they punch it into the chef, and it arrives at the table. That sort of thing?
I think anything is possible, and especially since technology is changing so rapidly. We're going to be all doing self-driving cars within a few years.
And some of us will be living on Mars and commuting from home.
There you go. There you go.
So
I'm very optimistic about the future. I believe that the glass is half full, not half empty. But I also think it's because men and women alike recognize that parenting is an important role and an enjoyable role to play. And you don't have to sacrifice one for the other in terms of work versus family.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joann Lublin of the Wall Street Journal and the author of the new book, Power Moms. All good luck to you and success with your new book. And thank you for joining us. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and follow us on our PBS website, which is www.tothecontrary.org. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next week.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more. PBS.